Good morning. This is Bernd Giels coming to you once again here on my YouTube channel. And today in this episode 46 of my YouTube channel, I am going to be speaking at greater length about my recent life history in the last 18 months. This is a follow-up to episode 45 in which I began to discuss my decision to disclose much of what I have experienced in the last many months. And as I noted in my previous video in episode 45, I came to decide to disclose much of my recent life history after many months of wrangling with the implications of choosing to do so. So in this episode, I'm going to speak more about my background, my recent history, and provide more of a context so that you, my viewers, can understand who I am as a person. So I want to start this episode actually by talking about some of the basic principles that I try to follow as a professional person. And these are principles that I enumerated a number of years ago while I was doing some professional development work. So what I'm going to share now is a series of principles that I attempt to follow in my professional life. And I'm sharing these so that you, my viewers, can better understand the type of person that I try to be in my professional life. So I believe in adhering to certain key values as a practicing professional as well as a researcher. And these principles are the following, these values I should say. One is access and inclusion. Another key value that I believe in is the importance of collaboration. Another is diversity. Another is continuous quality improvement. Another is accountability. And another is integrity. And so I'm going to spend just a bit of time now elaborating upon what these 6 different values mean to me. So when I say access and inclusion, I basically am speaking about the idea of continuously preparing, inviting, and welcoming people to an environment where all have the opportunity to thrive. I myself have enjoyed many opportunities throughout my life. I have also experienced some immense hardship. And some of my hardship that I have experienced has resulted from a denial of access to that which I should have had access to both when I was a minor as well as in my adult life. One very formative experience that I have in my life history is experiencing an immense injustice when I was an 8-year-old boy and my father was nearly murdered, and the perpetrators of that act were not held accountable within the legal system in this country. I did not understand clearly what the details were of that time in my life until many years later, and my understanding of what occurred has been almost exclusively described to me by my father, who is really the most knowledgeable person about what happened to him when I was 8 years old. I believe in creating a world in which equal opportunity is possible for those who wish to participate. Secondly, I believe in the value of collaboration. And when I say collaboration, I define that as creating equitable and collaborative partnerships to work effectively together. In other words, cultivating, rewarding, and mutually enhancing relationships. So, to be a collaborative person is to be someone who supports creating a world of equal opportunity, which can be more easily realized when we seek to collaborate with those who make up the communities around us. Another key value that I believe in is diversity. And there are obviously many definitions of diversity in the world. Some of them are defined in the context of workplaces. Some of them are defined more in the context of other major institutions, such as religious institutions and churches. And then there are other definitions of diversity according to other disciplines, such as the natural sciences, for example. In my particular context I'm speaking about here, I define diversity as actively and intentionally using models and practices that incorporate content that reflects diverse ways of knowing, being, and experiencing the world. In an ideal world, the creation of knowledge will be an activity that welcomes a variety of methods of developing insight and understanding of the world around us and the people that we share the world with. Another key value that I believe in is something I call continuous quality improvement. What I mean by continuous quality improvement is engaging in continuous individual and institutional reflection and collaboration to build capacity and integrate what we learn into our culture and infrastructure. Throughout my professional history, I have consistently believed in the value of continuous quality improvement. And one of the ways that I try to measure my success in upholding that value is being able to leave a company or an organization in a better position than when I first became an active contributing member of that party. So this particular value has long informed my way of working in the world. Another value that I believe is very important is accountability. And just as with diversity and these other values that I've described, accountability has many definitions. I believe that people should be accountable for their actions, both as individuals as well as when they work within institutions in this world. I believe that people that commit crimes and that are inappropriate, unkind, vicious, break the rules, should be held accountable for their actions. In an ideal world, I believe that such people should be willing to hold themselves accountable for their own conduct. Sometimes that doesn't happen, obviously, and so we need to have institutions in place to be able to protect our society from bad actors and others who either willingly or unknowingly violate the rules and cause harm. Now, I should clarify what I just said by further saying that I believe, obviously, there is an important distinction between those who harm others unknowingly or unwittingly and those who deliberately seek to break the law and harm others in a variety of contexts. Those two particular scenarios are quite distinct in their implications, and I believe fundamentally in another value, which is giving people the benefit of the doubt, meaning giving people the benefit of my willingness to believe that they are always acting in the highest good for themselves and for those around them. So I try always to give people the benefit of the doubt and see situations in the most positive light possible. Do I always succeed? No, I do not, because the world is complex and sometimes the situations we find ourselves in are complicated, in which many factors are contributing to a difficult situation that there is no clear, easy answer to apply. Finally, another important value that I believe in is integrity. And integrity, I believe, is very intimately intertwined with accountability. Integrity can be defined in many ways as well. In my view, in the setting of the workplace, integrity is demonstrated when people fulfill their obligations, are honest, participate with other people in a common endeavor in good faith, are willing to be corrected, and are willing to grow as people. So these are 6 major values that I try to follow in my professional life, both in my past work as a researcher as well as in other roles that I've held. And I will briefly re-articulate them. They are access and inclusion, collaboration, diversity, continuous quality improvement, accountability, and integrity. So that is an approach that I try to bring to my life in the world, and not just my professional life, but also my personal life. It is this perspective that informs my approach when I take on any new job. And it is an approach that I have developed over time through the people that have mentored me, through my formal education, and through my own personal life experience. I'm now going to transition and begin to speak about the last many months of my life in greater detail. I moved to the state of Massachusetts in late 2018 on Christmas Eve. I moved here at the invitation of two friends that I knew from several years prior to that time. I moved here after having lived in the state of Washington, where I had moved in July of 2017 in the hope of advancing my career in the marine affairs and ocean policy industry. I had moved to the state of Washington specifically to work for a museum as a maritime educator. This role was a role that I found within the Washington Service Corps program, which is basically one of the many member organizations under the umbrella of the AmeriCorps family of programs. For those of you not in the know, the AmeriCorps family of programs is a national service program that often gives young people right out of college the opportunity to contribute to communities in meaningful ways, develop job experience and skills, and ultimately move on to more influential roles, perhaps in government or in the private sector. So I moved to the state of Washington in the summer of 2017 in the hope of pursuing a role that would ultimately advance me to a higher level of performance and compensation in this particular field of marine affairs and ocean policy. I had previous experience as an educator, and I have always loved museums, so I thought it was a very good role for me. Unfortunately, the person that was my supervisor was not exceedingly professional in her communications with me, and over time we found ourselves in a difficult working relationship. I attempted to bring forth the values that I've just enumerated in this role, and I also had to work hard. AmeriCorps members are not paid much money, and so customarily a person either has to work a second job or rely on the support of family to be able to succeed in such a role. Now, I didn't have any family in the city of Tacoma, Washington, where I live, and so it was fairly challenging for me when I moved there to have the supports in place to do well in my role. I had an existing health condition, actually more than one. I was aware of these conditions, but despite being aware of them, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to successfully manage them if your life is exceedingly stressful, as mine was during that period of time. So I did the best that I could. I ultimately decided to leave my role prematurely, which is not something I believe in. I am a very dedicated person when it comes to completing the commitments that I undertake. And sadly, due to difficulties working with my supervisor, I decided to leave my role after 3 months. Unfortunately, what evolved thereafter was also very troubling. I made a formal complaint against my former supervisor because of her conduct. In my opinion, which I believe is a very well-informed opinion, considering that at the time I had about 22, 23 years of work history and 2 graduate degrees, and I had traveled to different parts of the world and had many amazing experiences. In my considered opinion, my supervisor did not display significant emotional intelligence in regards to how she communicated with me. She was infantilizing at times, and there was a particular day in which she reprimanded me just one day after a meeting of the staff that was troubling to me because it was disclosed that there was apparently an issue of harassment of volunteers occurring in the museum. And I, with my history of having been traumatized as a young boy, was sensitive to the potential for being in an environment where there was harassment and mistreatment of people going on. Despite learning this and being very upset about it, I went to work the next day and nonetheless had my supervisor deal with me in a way that I found very unprofessional and insensitive. That was one of several interactions that I had with her that I found very troubling. I followed the proper procedures for expressing my concerns about my working relationship with my supervisor, and despite my efforts, I ultimately came to conclude it was in my best interests to leave my role and pursue other endeavors. I filed a formal complaint against her. That complaint led to an investigation, and in that investigation, my former supervisor made over 20 false statements to investigators working on behalf of a federal government agency. I was infuriated and outraged when I learned about the many, many false statements that my supervisor made against me. My complaint, as I understand it, did not ultimately immediately result in any professional consequences to my former supervisor. One of her particular false statements was particularly concerning given the nature of what she stated. I am not going to articulate this particular bit of information here, but suffice to say it was the type of statement that can be highly damaging to a person's future career. I ultimately left the state of Washington and moved to Massachusetts approximately 2 years ago, as I've mentioned earlier in this recording. But I was still very upset and disheartened by the way I had been treated in that role. I had made significant sacrifices to take that position in the state of Washington. Prior to living there, I had been living in the Washington, D.C. area, pursuing an internship in the hope of advancing my career in the marine affairs industry. I left behind an international city, namely Washington, D.C., a chorus that I loved singing in, and friends that I had made, all for the sake of advancing my career, which in that instance entailed me moving thousands of miles to the other side of the country to take a role in a city I had never lived in where I had no friends, and which required me, out of financial necessity, to take a second job. So it was a very demanding thing that I did. And I was trying to be generous because I have long been a generous person, and I believe in generosity as another professional and personal principle. Unfortunately, it turned out very badly, and so I decided to leave the state of Washington after a period of time, and I moved to the state of Massachusetts. So that was the immediate recent history to my life when I moved to Massachusetts 2 years ago. I was very upset by what had happened and by the damage that had been done to my life because I had decided to be a generous, kind, contributing member of society. So I moved to the state of Washington. 3 months after moving here, I found a job. And this job was with a company called Vinfen Corporation. If you go to the website for Vinfen, which is found at vinfen.org, you will see, obviously, their statement about what they do. And I'm going to just repeat it to you here so you understand exactly how they market themselves. On the Vinfen website, when you go to the About tab, you will find Vinfen described as such. For 40 years, Vinfen has been dedicated to transforming lives. We are a leading provider of community-based services to people with psychiatric conditions, intellectual and developmental disabilities, brain injuries, and behavioral health challenges. Our dedicated staff use the latest in science-based interventions to support the people we serve in achieving their goals and leading more independent, productive, and valued lives as members of their community. The page further describes Vinfen as follows. Vinfen is one of the most dynamic and innovative health and human services organizations in the country. With over 200 locations in Massachusetts and Connecticut, we are a premier provider of comprehensive services for adolescents and adults with disabilities or life challenges. We provide a wide range of evidence-based programs in recovery, supported living, habilitation, education, employment, clinical, and peer support to the populations we serve. Now, sounds very inspired, does it not? When I first learned about Vinfen and I researched the company online, I was genuinely inspired by the company's mission and by the content that I read. And because I had previously worked in the healthcare industry, And because I was interested in that as a possibility for what I would do with my professional future, I decided to apply for a job with the company. In fact, I applied to several different roles. And I eventually was offered an interview. I interviewed with the supervisor of a group home on Cape Cod where I was living, and I was ultimately hired. I was hired as a residential counselor, and I worked in the small town of Cotuit on Cape Cod. I worked at a group home there, and I worked there for several months. My first day with the company was April 1st, 2019. I went through training in the Boston metro area, and I ultimately began my job on Cape Cod in mid-April of 2019. I enjoyed working for the company at first. I was inspired by the mission statement, and I initially believed there was genuine potential for me to contribute my skills in a meaningful way and actually develop a career within the company. In the first weeks on site at the group home where I worked, I focused very much on learning the job. Obviously, when you take any new job, there is a learning curve and you will need time to learn how to do your job. I was confident that I would be able to do my job well because of my past work history. I wasn't a young person right out of college in my 20s. I was an experienced person in my 40s with significant life experience and professional experience, which I could bring to this particular role. As time passed, I became increasingly uncomfortable with a few different issues. One was the nature of the hygiene of some of the residents that I worked with. It concerned me because in my research, trying to better understand my health condition of fibromyalgia, I came across research and data that suggested that people who have fibromyalgia are at a higher risk, generally speaking, of contracting and developing infectious conditions as compared to the general population. One particular concern I have, one sensitivity that I have, is that I personally do not do well with mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, and other biting animals. And I am sensitive to that partly because when I was a younger man, my parents were apparently exposed to Lyme disease. And as someone who already had some health issues, including fibromyalgia, I was concerned that being exposed to mosquitoes, fleas, ticks, or anything of the like, that I might actually contract a health condition that would cause me more trouble than I already have had to deal with in my life. One of the residents in particular had such poor hygiene that I felt uncomfortable having to work very closely with him. Now, I should clarify that when I began my role, it was not my understanding that the clients that I would serve had such serious issues with hygiene. And the reason that I did not understand that was because it was not disclosed to me in sufficient detail just how substantial some of the residents' hygiene challenges were. Obviously, as a prospective employee, it was my responsibility also to research the particular requirements of the job to be assured that I would be able to perform the job well. I did visit the group home on site where I interviewed with the supervisor, but I did not go into the rooms of the residents at that time to see the type of environment that they lived in. I trusted the process of the application process, that it was clear and that I had a correct and thorough understanding of the role that I was taking on. When I started to become increasingly concerned about this matter of hygiene, I did broach it with my supervisor in what I believe was a timely way. And that became the basis for my later decision to request a reasonable accommodation by virtue of my own health condition and request that certain duties of the role be things that I either not do or perhaps could do in conjunction with another person. That was my intent in requesting a reasonable accommodation. There were other concerns that I had as well. One of my major concerns was that some of the other staff that I worked with were not very responsible in terms of time. One of my coworkers, who was pregnant at the time, had a habit of frequently showing up to work late. She would be on the schedule to start at 8 a.m. and she would arrive at 8:30 or 9 a.m. When I first took my role, I did not raise any concern about this because I was focused on doing my job. But also, important to note, I did not raise my concern about this initially because I tried to give this individual the benefit of the doubt. Because she was pregnant, I thought perhaps she came to work late several days because she had morning sickness perhaps, or perhaps because the children she already had were having a difficult time getting ready for school, or perhaps there were other issues. Perhaps she had a reasonable accommodation in place that provided some manner of flexibility for when she would end up showing up late to work. So I tried to be as understanding as possible and give her the benefit of the doubt. This pattern continued, however, and it increasingly made me uncomfortable because it was not uncommon for there to be only 2 people on staff for the first hour of the day. And the responsibilities that I had in my role of trying to help 5 different individuals with their daily life activities was challenging at times given the severity of some of the issues that these particular clients faced in their daily functioning. So over time, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the habits of my coworker. And there was also another coworker who was actually a contract worker. She was employed through a third-party entity whose identity I do not know. She was a night shift worker. She would routinely come to work late when coming in to start the night shift. She would be scheduled to start at 10 o'clock, and she would start and arrive at 10:30 frequently. In the mornings when she got off work, when I would come into work, it was not uncommon for her to almost immediately walk out the door the moment that she saw me come into the office. And while she was not, to my knowledge, trained as a nurse to where she would give a report to the incoming staff in the morning, I did find it concerning that she would not even take 1 minute of time to give me some sense of how the previous night had unfolded, meaning how did the clients we were serving who lived at this group home, how did they do in the previous night? And so I found these different issues concerning. And between these issues and the hygiene concerns I had, I ultimately requested a reasonable accommodation of my employer. This process unfolded within the months of May, June, and July of 2019. I'm going to cut this video off here shortly to maintain the 30-minute window of time that I seek to create with these videos, and just summarize by saying what happened ultimately was I requested a reasonable accommodation. The accommodation process was complicated by some mistakes that were made. I was ultimately denied the accommodation, and I was never, in my opinion, given sufficient opportunity to engage in the, quote, interactive process of requesting a reasonable accommodation that is, as I understand it, the policy in place for when employees request a reasonable accommodation. In the next video, I will describe further what a reasonable accommodation is as a way of starting to describe the further sequence of events that unfolded. In short, what happened was I requested an accommodation, it was denied, I was later suspended and investigated due to issues that had no merit, and that particular sequence of events started me down a path that was particularly painful and horrific that unfolded for many, many months thereafter. I will describe this in further detail in my upcoming video. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.